Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are so excited to have Rachel Beanland here to talk about her book, The House is on Fire. I'm just going to give her a quick introduction because I know you don't want to hear from me. So Rachel Beanland is the author of the novel Florence Adler Swims Forever. She is a graduate of the University of South Carolina, where she earned her MFA in creative writing from Virginia Commonwealth University. She lives with her husband and 3 children in Richmond, Vermont, and she's here to talk about The House is on Fire. Based on the true story of Richmond's theater fire, The House is on Fire offers proof that sometimes in the midst of great tragedy, we are offered our most precious and fleeting chances at redemption. We are so excited to have her here, you guys here. I want to send a special thank you to our Books by the Sea members. Thank you so much for being here today. We are so excited that you joined us this weekend, and I'm going to pass it off to Rachel to get us started. Thank you.
Is this going to pick me up, or do I need to actually hold it?
So no, that's just for our recording.
Okay,
It's not
so it
fair.
doesn't matter.
If
Okay.
you don't hear something, you can find out, yeah. No,
I'm gonna
it's
correct
fine.
the record just a tiny bit. I'm from Virginia, not Vermont. Okay. You guys are in New England and no, but just you were gonna get really confused when I started talking about the Richmond, Vermont theater fire. So, guys, can I take one picture of you guys? You're all very adorable, and if you want to hold up books, you're certainly welcome to fight the shot. You guys may not make it in, but I'll just separate that. Oh my gosh, so cute. Yes. Oh my gosh. Hold on. This crew gets the resolution. Hi, guys. Yeah, we don't want to leave you out. Okay, so cute.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for having me, for coming out, for buying the book. I'm so appreciative. I thought what I would do is spend a little bit of time today talking about the Richmond theater fire and kind of what inspired the story, and then I will open it up to questions, and you can hit me with anything. I'm an open book, so to speak. So I live in Richmond, Virginia. I moved there in 2007. I was born in Connecticut, so I feel like I should get that out of the immediately. But I only spent 6 months in this beautiful state. My dad was a submariner. And then I was a Navy kid. We moved around, but finally in 2007, my husband and I settled down in Richmond, Virginia. And I was very lucky because on the very first day that I showed up in Richmond, and I really mean the very first day, a realtor was driving me around town and was driving. Is anyone familiar with Richmond? Okay, all right. So was driving me down Broad Street toward Churchill, and he points at Monumental Church out the window, and he says, there used to be a theater on this site. This church was built as a monument to the 72 people who died in the Richmond theater fire. And he told me a little bit more about the fire, not much. He didn't know a lot. But I was immediately intrigued with the story. At the time, I was probably 26, 27. I was not writing novels. I would have loved it if someone had told me that I was going to one day write novels, but I was always writing something, and I always was a huge reader, and there was something about that story that just had me glued from the very beginning. Fast forward, I wrote another novel, Florence Adler Swims Forever. It came out in July of 2020. And when that book came out, I was at the beginning of writing something else, a second project that was going to require a lot of travel to get right. And what were we all doing in July of 2020? Oh, you might remember. So I was in my house, there were no planes in the sky, and I did not know when I was ever going to get on an airplane again, when any of us were ever going to get on an airplane again. And I started to get really concerned that I would never write another novel again as a result of this. And so I started to think about what I might be able to write that would be set in my own backyard, something where I could do all the research from the comfort of my home or, adjacent buildings to my home. And it just dawned on me that it might be the right time to write something about the Richmond theater fire. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Richmond theater fire now. The Richmond theater fire was at the time, so it happened December 26th, 1811. To set the stage a little bit, this is the winter social season in Richmond, Virginia. like a lot of places, Virginia only did kind of governmental politicking for a very brief period of time in the winter months when you could not plant anything in the ground, right? So it was an agricultural society. People would come in from their farms, they'd come to the capital city. It was a chance to get business done, to get their politics done, and also to see family and friends. They would go to card parties, they would go to plays, they would go to cockfights, unfortunately. But it was really the social season in Richmond. Christmas was not as big a deal at that time. So we kind of think about, oh, December 26th, like must have been, Christmas trees galore. We weren't quite there yet as a country. We were a little bit godless, in fact, in that era. Because you have to remember that the Church of England disappeared with the British, right? The British go home after the Revolution and they take their Church of England with them. And so in Richmond, like a lot of places, people were kind of floundering around trying to figure out, like, am I religious? Am I not religious? Like a lot of the churches were in disrepair. There weren't enough churches to take care of everyone who might have even wanted to go to one. And so people were just kind of living it up. The theater could seat 600 people, which was a lot of people when you think about the fact that the city of Richmond was only 10,000 people at that time. So 10,000 people, about 5,000 white residents, and about 5,000 free and enslaved Blacks. And what attracted me to the story of the theater, and I think what just continues to make the story so interesting, is that the theater really represented kind of a microcosm for life in the city. And so when that theater caught on fire, it affected people from a wide range of, people from a wide range of different backgrounds. So in the theater, you had box seats, which were the highest ticket prices. They were accessible via one staircase. There's one staircase in the whole place. There was one door, one egress for all of the boxes, and then also the pit, which was the downstairs, like first floor seating. In the pit, people didn't tend to actually sit down and watch the play. It was more a chance to mill around and talk to your friends. People didn't, now we think of going to the theater and you're very quiet and the lights go down. At this point, going to the theater is just another excuse to party. Everyone is just roaming, talking to friends. No one can hear what the actors are really saying. And everything is kind of at capacity, right? There's no fire marshal saying, guys, you hit your limit. So we've got the pit, we've got the boxes, and then there was what was at the time called a colored gallery, which was for free and enslaved Blacks, as well as quote unquote drunks and prostitutes. That was everyone that could go into that gallery. The gallery had its own entrance and its own set of stairs, so accessible from the side of the building, which of course we, overall we're not in favor of that, but that particular night it ended up being pretty useful. And then we have the actors backstage, and the actors had their own entrance, which helped them out significantly. Everyone's in the theater, at that time there were 2 plays a night, so there would be one drama and then one pantomime. You would go to the theater for the whole long night, right? Many hours. And so they were into the pantomime section of the performance when a fire started backstage. I won't give away all the details about how it started because of course you'll be reading about it very soon. But there was a fire. It started over in the fly space over the heads of the actors. And so the actors could see this fire. They knew that the stage crew was trying their hardest to put it out, but they had this decision to make. Do we, announce this to the crowd of 600 people and risk a stampede? Or do we give the stage crew time to work? And finally, they turned to the audience and said, the house is on fire. At that point, everyone, rushes out of the building or tries their best to rush out of the building. But it was very difficult to get out. There were all kinds of, the building's poor design made it difficult. But then there were other issues like the fact that the theater company had boarded up all the windows because of a draft. Like it was winter, so they didn't want the draft, or it kind of ended up being really pandemonium, as you might expect. So by the end of the night, the governor has died, a former senator has died, the president of the Bank of Virginia has died. So, a lot of what I say kind of the muckety mucks, right, have died. But overall, it was overwhelmingly women who died. So 54 out of the 72 people who died in the fire were women. And in the hours and days after the fire, that was a big question that people wanted answered, was how come so many women lost their lives? The men had a lot of answers for this, as you might expect. Any men in the audience, I apologize. But they, at first were saying, well, the dresses were a real problem, but we're in Jane Austen era, in terms of dress styles. Like we've got empire waists, and a good friend of mine is the Meredith Penny Baker, who wrote the nonfiction version of the book about the Richmond theater fire. And we were talking about this dress excuse, and she said, Rachel, have you ever held one of those dresses in your hand? And I said, no. And she said, well, you can ball the whole thing up into your fist. Like it's made of nothing, flimsy material. So you do hear stories about women, escaping a fire and they're not wearing clothes by the time they get out, but we're not so sure about this excuse that the dresses really impeded their escape. Some men claimed that one of the reasons the women had died in such high numbers was that they had, they were so virtuous and so chivalrous that they had given up their seats in the boxes long before, the fire started. And so the men were all down in the pit and the women were in the boxes, and that was the problem. But when we look at the historical record, there are newspapers as far away as Baltimore that are saying, hey, what's happening here? We've got these Virginians who claim to be so genteel, and how come all of their wives and mothers died? So that became something I was very interested in. I ended up deciding to structure the book by following the lives of 4 people who were in the theater that night. All 4 people are to some extent based on real people who lived and breathed, though we know considerably more about some of them than others. So I followed a young stagehand named Jack Gibson, who's working backstage. He's 14 years old. He has a hand in the start of the fire. I won't say exactly how he's involved, but he knows what happened. And of course, I'm a mother of teenagers. So as soon as I knew that there had been a young stagehand involved, I thought, well, of course there were problems there. And I very much wanted to have a window into the life of the theater company. The theater company that night was, and the theater company that had been in Richmond for several months at that point was actually a Charleston-based theater company. Placide and Green. And so they'd come up from Charleston. They had kind of traveling troupes in the same way that we have, Broadway on tour now. They had these traveling troupes that would go to southern cities. Charleston was really like a mecca for theater. They would send out these troupes, and they had a troupe here since August of that year performing. They'd performed over 24 different shows in the span of 4 months or something. So I wanted to follow someone who was with the theater company. I wanted to follow a woman in the boxes because the boxes were so difficult to get out of. And so I followed the daughter of Patrick Henry, Sally Henry Campbell. Family legend lore puts her at the theater that night. They say she survived. And so I began to think about what it would have been like to be a woman of some means, but not enough means to necessarily be able to help yourself and your friends out of that predicament. And then I follow 2 enslaved characters. I follow an enslaved blacksmith named Gilbert Hunt. who we actually probably know the most about him of any of the four characters. He was not at the fire initially when the fire broke out at the theater. He was not there, but he rushed to the scene to try to save the daughter of some of his wife's owners, and so got to the theater and ended up by the end of the night he had saved a dozen white women from the blaze. And there becomes this kind of whole question of will the community reward him for his bravery. And then the last person I follow is someone named Cecily Patterson, who is based on a real woman named Nancy Patterson. When the list of the dead was published, these 72 names, there were 6 people who were Black or multiracial. And they were always listed separately because, of course, it was 1811 in Richmond, Virginia. And of those 6 people, a couple of them have strange notations next to them, which would lead you to believe that at least in 1811, somebody believed that they maybe had not died in the fire. So Nancy Patterson's name next to it had the words supposed to have perished, which is a strange thing to put on a list of the dead when everyone else is just listed as dead. And then there was another enslaved person named Philadelphia who is listed as missing, which also didn't quite make sense. So historians today believe that at least at that time, there was someone who thought that these 2 people might have used the fire as a convenient alibi and made plans to disappear. So those are the 4 people that I follow. And I think at this point, I might turn it over to you guys to questions. I can keep talking, but you might have more specific questions. Yeah.
Can I ask how new at that time was the actual theater, in terms of building one?
Yeah.
And then do you see any kind of juxtaposition between that and maybe the Titanic and where class seating determines your survivability?
Yes. Yeah, my agent was just emailing me saying, we really need to use Titanic as a comp when we're looking at film rights. And I'm like, yes, please, God. If I could just have a film produced that was like, a 10th as popular as Titanic, that would be fine. So absolutely. I mean, that was the thing that affected that inspired me when I learned about the theater fire initially, and then as I read more in the summer of 2020 and was really seriously thinking about writing about it, was that your race, your gender, and your class all had a huge influence on whether you made it out of the fire or not. And I just thought it seemed so dreadfully unfair in most cases. I mean, in some cases it wound up being very fair, but I was very intrigued by that idea. And I can't remember, wait, what was the first part of your question?
Was the building like a new?
Oh, the building, yeah. So it was not very old. It was about 5 years old. There had been a theater on that same lot that had also burned down. Of course, because remember, every piece of pyrotechnics, like anything that they're doing in terms of special effects, is all done with flames. Like, there's not even gas lighting at this point. We're 100% just like lighting candles all over the place. So anyway, lots of open flames. And so a theater had burned down maybe a dozen years earlier. And then it had taken the theater company a long time to fundraise for a new theater. And what is ironic is that the theater company had actually gone to Benjamin Latrobe, one of the most famous architects of the day, and asked for a fireproof design of this like replacement theater. And he had designed a building that, fireproof is a word we should probably throw around loosely, but in 1811, was what it was. And they couldn't afford it. They just couldn't afford it. So they went with a more traditional, with like a brick 3-story building, dirt floors on the first floor, wooden floors on the next 2 floors. Like I said, this single wooden staircase, and I won't give too much away, but that staircase ends up being, you know, pretty harmful for a lot of people. And yeah, it was kind of the best they could do. And it was only in existence for about 5 years before this fire took place. Yeah, no insurance back then, so they had to, you know, often they would fundraise for a theater by selling subscriptions to, you know, we use the same subscription model now, but we're not actually paying for the whole building out of our subscription, right? Yeah. Yeah.
So I started reading this on my lunch break, and I can already tell my weekend is ruined, but.
You've made your weekend.
But I guess the fire, I don't think this is giving us away. The fire starts on page 40, which
Yeah.
I had just assumed that it would be sort of the climb.
Towards the end,
And
yeah.
so I'm very interested in how you made that. decision.
Yeah, no, great question, and it's one I get a lot. So, yeah, I basically start the book, I'm getting all the characters to the theater. You know, you're kind of getting your establishing shots of all of them, and then we're there, and the fire takes place. This is very much an aftermath story, so I'm interested in what happens after the fire has happened, how people justify their own survival, how they grieve as a community. I had written my first novel, which is called Florence Adler Swims Forever. You have a copy, you can hold it up. There we go. Ta-da. So Florence Adler Swims Forever was based on the true story of, I had a great aunt who was training to swim the English Channel, and she drowned off the coast of Atlantic City when she was 19 years old. And so this was in 1929 that it happened, the drowning. My grandmother was a little girl on the beach that day when they brought her body back up onto the shore. And her mother, my great grandmother, was in the hospital on bed rest. She had lost a baby the previous summer. She was pregnant again. And the family made the decision that they did not want to tell her sister had died, that they just thought it was going to be too much and it might risk her losing another baby. And so they all kind of conspired to keep this secret of the death, right? So I had always grown up knowing about this secret keeping, and the women in my family had kind of always made such a big thing of it, and said it was they all universally agreed that it had been the right thing to do. And I remembered growing up and being like, I don't know, seems kind of awful, guys. But so when I started thinking about writing a novel, I wanted to write about that story, but that was another aftermath story. So, you know, the drowning happens very much in the beginning of the book, 11 pages in. I'm not giving anything away if you haven't read it. And then the real story is about what happens to this family that summer as they are keeping this secret. So I think that in both cases, I was interested in grief. I was interested in how people move on after, you know, great losses. And the stories we tell ourselves to kind of make peace with what's happened. So yeah, there's kind of a similar with The House is on Fire. On the surface, the two books don't have much to do with each other. You know, Florence Adler is actually set in 1934, and we got 1811. But they are both aftermath stories. Yeah. So blue scarf, and then yeah.
So taking place in 1811, how much interviewing opportunities did you have to get their feelings?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously I wasn't able to interview very many people, but I did a ton of research, a ton. Like I keep telling myself now as I think about book number 3, like, Rachel, is there any way you could come up with something that requires slightly less research than you had to do with this one? But I think I naturally like the research a lot. I did a lot of research for the first book too. And in this case, what I haven't maybe conveyed about the fire is that it was in its day, it was like the 9/11 of our lives. So it was a gigantic event, not just for Richmond and not just for Virginia, but for the entire United States. Our country was only 35 years old, and we had never lost that many people in a single event before, like a single one-day calamity. So it really kind of captured everyone's attention and imagination. You had ministers giving sermons at churches all up and down the Eastern Seaboard. So, Boston, even as far away as London, people were giving sermons and, addresses about the fire. In all of these cities, you could purchase these commemorative books about the fire they had the kind of clippings from all the newspaper articles. They had the inquest report. They had a bunch of first-person accounts, of course, all written by men, some of whom had not even been at the fire. But it was there were lots of commemorative items you could buy so that you could go home and remember the fire for the rest of your days. Engravings, like all kinds of stuff. So there are these really rich archives of materials that I had at my disposal. The Library of Virginia has great archives. The Virginia Museum of History and Culture has great archives. And I really tried to just immerse myself in these documents. I had great secondary sources too. As I mentioned, there's a nonfiction book about the fire, and there were some wonderful, secondary sources about race relations in Richmond, or, just history in Richmond, and all. I used all of that, but I was particularly drawn to the first person accounts because there was a lot that you could read between the lines, like what people are not saying. That to me became a big part of the story. Who's not speaking. I mean, at that point, so many women had died in the fire, but the newspaper would not print testimonials by women. So you have no accounts of women in the fire until their diaries start to be published 90 years later, or their letters start to be published, right? So just much, much later, we're getting the accounts of the women. And then, of course, if you were a person of color, your account was never going to be published. And so that's a whole other story that we don't get until many, many years later. So I became really fascinated with the research. Yeah.
Speaking of the research, I actually read this book last week and it's
Oh,
phenomenal.
Thank you. Thank you.
And your research was impeccable.
Thank
But
you.
I'm wondering how you determined the 4 voices that you were going to use. Like in your research, did you come across a bunch of characters that you could have drawn on and just narrowed down before? I mean, I loved it. I loved the 4 that you picked.
I
love you told it.
wanted to choose people who didn't have power, there were so many men in that era who were kind of calling the shots, and some of them worked their way into the book. Like I've got William Wirt in there, and I've got Thomas Ritchie, and I've got John Marshall and his son, and they're all in there. But I felt like from my point of view characters, I wanted to kind of give voice to the people who had not had voices at the time of the fire.
Yeah.
And so for me, that was, a white woman, a white stagehand who's young still, right? And also theater, remember at that time is like not considered like a profession that is worth anything. And so he's voiceless. And then of course, too, enslaved people are obviously going to be very voiceless at that time. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
I have one, and this is more personal, and you don't have to answer it. But
I probably will.
it said in 26 you were doing something much different than when you were writing. So what led to your writing career?
Yeah, so I've always been a huge reader and have always been writing. Like if we go back and look at my childhood crap, it's like, I was winning like essay contests for like what the American flag means to me. And I wrote my autobiography in 7th grade. It was 75 pages long. I don't know what I managed to say about my life there, but so I was always writing. But I have to say, I grew up in a very practical household, and I'm not throwing any shade on my parents, but like they definitely wanted me to have like a job with some benefits. And so it just never occurred to me that I could be a novelist. I mean, that wasn't on the radar, even though like these were parents who both read tremendously. And we had a rule in my household, in fact, that as long as you were reading a book, you never had a bedtime. So as long as I was in bed with a book, I could stay up as late as I wanted. So everyone, you would have thought I would have figured out being a novelist was a job, but I did not. And so in college, I studied art history and journalism, and the journalism was a PR focus. So I was thinking, okay, well, I'll write press releases and website copy and all that kind of stuff. And that'll scratch that writing itch. And of course, I don't know who here works in PR, but it doesn't really scratch the same itch. And so I did that for like 15 years, and then was writing a novel. I started writing Florence Adler while having a full-time job and some kids. And I would just set up, wake up really early and write the novel. And it, for me, the best thing to come out of getting that novel published was the fact that I got to quit the job in PR and say, like, okay, like my identities are one and the same. Because I used to always say, oh, well, I work in PR, but I really like to write, and then it was like all one and the same thing. I felt like one whole person. So it was good. Yeah. Yeah.
You said you love to read, and I asked this question last night of the authors again for this. What are some books that you love that you recommend to people? Either like tried and true favorites or things you've read recently.
Yeah. So I mean, anything Curtis Sittenfeld writes, I will. I mean, I've read every book in that woman's oeuvre. And so I do adore her. I adore Jesmyn Ward. I adore Anne Patchett. I know it's really predictable, and I'm sorry. But those are I always say kind of like three of my real faves. But I tend to stick to literary fiction. I mean, that's just where I'm happy. I've gone through bouts where I'll read a lot of memoirs or something else, but I tend to kind of stay firmly in literary fiction. Yeah. Yeah.
So as a white woman, how did you find the voice of the characters that were on the stage?
Yeah. With a lot of research and a lot of work.
Do you think you accurately got it?
I mean, I hope so. You'll have to ask someone else, not me, I was really honored. There was a NPR review of the book that spent a lot of time focusing on like the race piece of the story, and was very complimentary, and it was like my favorite review I think I've ever received, because I'd worked so hard at the book that it felt just really validating to hear someone say like, you did good. I felt somewhat more comfortable approaching this book because my children are all multiracial. And so I have spent a lot of time reading and thinking about race prior to jumping into the novel. I think if you were just a novelist who kind of never opened your eyes to anything, and then you said, I'm going to do this, it would be a really hard thing to fight off. But so I had spent many years thinking about it in advance, kind of thinking about it deeply. But then when I did decide that I was going to write from multiple perspectives, including multiple races, I felt like, I needed to read as much as I possibly could, both nonfiction, of course, about race relations, specifically in Virginia and specifically in Richmond, but also just a lot of fiction. And I really tried to focus on, historical fiction set during that time frame, or maybe up to the Civil War, a little bit after, but also specifically historical fiction written by writers of color. So I was looking at everything very analytically, not just do I love this story, which of course it's hard not to love Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Water Dancer, but like, what is he doing with language? What is he doing with African American vernacular? Is it in dialogue? Is it in thought? Is it in exposition? Like, where, how is it showing up? So I really tried to be like a student, of language. And then of course it's also really important to let a wide variety of people read it after you've written it, to make sure that you're doing it right. Yeah.
As you know, I love this book. It's just a marvel. And I was wondering, were there what part did you particularly enjoy writing? Because it's all a pleasure to read, but what did you love?
Yeah. I loved writing Gilbert Hunt. So that's the enslaved blacksmith. He had a really interesting life, and we know a good bit about his life. And he made really good choices like that in the aftermath of the fire, during the fire. And he felt like a person who was really steered by his own conscience. And so he was just, for me, like very enjoyable to write. It's hard to have like a favorite, but yeah, like I would say that he was kind of my favorite. I always like when I can kind of write a scene that's based on a heavy amount of research I've done, and then take the research but not make it look too researchy, like there's a lot of joy in taking everything you've like thrown in your head and then just writing a scene that really sings and makes you think like, oh, you're in 1811. Sometimes all that stuff gets thrown out the window though, like I joke, like I read an entire book on tanning between the years 1750 and 1820 in the United States, like a whole book on the process of tanning, because I thought I was going to have Jack's dad be a tanner. And then I didn't end up doing that for a variety of reasons. And now I just know a lot about tanning. And I have all these scenes that I wrote that I loved that were like about the tanning process. And like it's all just gone. But so I find that rewarding and no one else would, but I don't know. Yeah. Yeah.
Living in Richmond with so much history, did you find certain areas of the city a gold mine for visiting to set stages for housing and neighborhoods where your characters are living?
Yeah, so we actually made a little video for people who read the book and are interested in kind of learning a bit more about Richmond in that time. We made a video that's on Simon & Schuster's YouTube page, and it's linked from my website, and you can find it a couple of places, but where I do a historic tour of Richmond and kind of show you what was in existence then. Richmond obviously was much, much smaller then. So for those of you who've been to Richmond, we're really talking about the Shockoe Bottom area, which is where the wharf was. Church Hill, which is where Henrico Parish Church was, which is now St. John's. And then the Capitol and the theater were both up on what they called Shockoe Hill. We don't really call it that anymore, but which was at that time called this neighborhood called Court End. And that was where like the fancy people were starting to move and build fancier houses. So Court End still exists technically, and that like if you look at a map, you can see, oh, this is Court End. But most of it has actually been consumed by Virginia Commonwealth University's Medical Center. So you have to hunt pretty hard to find houses that were in existence at that time. But like the John Marshall House is there, and that's one I reference in the book. And John Wickham's house is there. So there are some really nice historic homes that would have been in existence at or around the time of the fire. Yeah.
Just an author, I don't know, question. I'm not. But so you're going about your day and all of a sudden a scene comes to you and you have to get to a computer, or you're planning out your day and this is computer time and I've got to.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's got to be the former, or the latter. It's 8 a.m. and I got to go sit at my computer because it's writing time. And then, who was it? Maybe it was Eudora Welty. Someone said like, you have to sit. Who was it who said this? I'm looking at you, Jen. But the line, it's like, I can wait for inspiration to strike, but if it doesn't strike, if I'm not at my desk, like sitting on my butt, like when it strikes, I won't capture it, as the gist. It might have been Flannery O'Connor.
I don't remember who it was, but it's true. Though.
It's true. Yeah. I mean, you just have to kind of you have to have a routine or else you're never going to get anything done. And especially in my case, like I have 3 kids and with this book in particular, I really had to protect my time because the bulk of this book was written during the pandemic while all 3 of my children were home for 18 months. 18 months. Virginia, our schools just completely shuttered and they did not open back up until September of 2021. So virtual school, it was a nightmare. So I'm very glad we all got out. Okay, we're fine. But you know, so my husband and I would like break up the day, you know, I'd go up for a couple hours, he'd come down, we were homeschooling a second grader, it was awful. But so in answer to your question, when it was my time up in the office, I had to sit there whether lightning had struck or not, you know. Yeah.
So it's kind of obvious what the answer is going to be, but how much plotting of this did you do and how much is the seat of your pants?
This is what I tell my creative writing students, and it is what I do. I try to outline the first part of the book, like the first, probably like to get me through this fire, for instance, like I outlined to figure out, okay, who's where, how are they going to intersect? What do I need to know? You know, enough to like get my training wheels, you know, off and figure out what I'm doing. And then I like to not have an outline because I feel like sometimes if you have an outline for the whole thing, it becomes kind of boring to write where you're not surprised by anything you're writing. And there has to be that element of surprise or that element of joy as you're writing. Because I mean, if you're not entertaining yourself, you're not going to entertain anyone else, right? So, and then once I get those through with a draft, I think, or close to the end of a draft, I think that's a decent time to go back and almost like re-outline and say, okay, what did I end up writing?
Okay.
What do I need
I
to
can make it.
write? What's missing? And kind of take it from there.
Dinner, do that.
Yeah.
Did you use the Library of Congress's database at all to find information?
I did for like specific documents I was looking at online, but I never went up there. Yeah. There were some good maps that I was able to use. I always find it helpful. First thing I do when I'm writing something historical is to find a map from as close to that time as possible. And I print it up out on foam, you know, print it up large and then put it on foam core. And I'll use little pins and, you know, put pins in for where scenes are taking place, or, you know, especially this book would confuse the hell out of me if I hadn't had a map, because all the streets were named different things in this era than what they are now in Richmond. And so I really needed that map.
You had mentioned the book that you were going to write that required a lot of travel.
I'm going back to it now. Yeah, it's a little early to say much more than that, but yes, the planes are back in the sky. I can resume my travel. It's a real shame that these writer types have to split off to exotic places, but I am gonna now go somewhere a little more exotic, and yeah, we'll see how it goes. But and I think I can safely tell you I'm coming forward in time a little.
One more question.
Yeah.
So you did your outline and then you got some maps and you started doing your storyboard. At what point in time did the characters start to speak to you, where you got 4 main characters now and then you began to develop them?
I knew I was going to write those 4 characters before I started writing anything. Like I knew I had a plan for these. Originally, I think I had a plan for 5 and then I went down to 4, but like I kind of had some sense of who these characters were going to be. The thing that takes me longer is figuring out their backstories and why are they motivated to do certain things. Like I really struggled with Jack and his backstory, trying to figure out, okay, why is he so desperate to work for this theater company? You know, because his story is very much like a coming of age story and you know, is he going to do the right thing? And, you know, and so what happened in his past that is making this choice so impossible for him? So that's where I kind of will stop and say, okay, wait, I don't know quite enough about this character. I need to do more research, or I need to think harder. And so sometimes as I'm writing, especially a multiple point of view book like this, 1 or 2 characters will get out in front of the others a little, where it's like, oh, if I know what Gilbert Hunt's doing, I'll keep going with him. But that can trip me up sometimes, because then, you know, I as I catch everyone else up, I realize, oh no, we needed to intersect with someone. So there's no perfect way to write a novel. Like novels are just gargantuan undertaking. And, you know, I've heard people say that every time you write a new novel, you have to teach yourself how to write a novel. And it really is true, because every time you do something different and the thing you did the last time no longer makes sense.
But to your writing style, do the characters come out right away? Or just in this book, you knew what you were doing?
Yeah, I mean, this one, because they were based on real people who had lived, I did know at least the basics about them. You know, like I knew I was gonna follow Patrick Henry's daughter, Sally Henry Campbell, and I knew brief biographical information about her. But for someone like Cecily Patterson in the book, because she's based on Nancy Patterson, who we know very little about besides just the name and the information on the list of the dead, I had to invent everything. So of course that one came a little more slowly for that reason. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, I did not read your first book, but it sounds wonderful, and I will do. But you mentioned family secrets in your first book, and then book, one of the four books we read, in the book would be, there was a family secret. And my personal family is a secret, and I just wanted your personal opinion on family secrets.
We should really be asking my mother. You know, my experience was that, I always tell my students, you have to write what you want to write. So like, if you're a writer and you're interested in writing a family secret, you go on and you write that family secret. And then you can always decide later, you know, if you're lucky enough to get published, if you're lucky enough to get an agent, or, you know, all these things, you can decide, like, I'm gonna tone down this family secret, or I'm gonna like change some names, or I'm gonna whatever, you know. And what I found with the story of my grandmother and her family was that my family was overall so thrilled for me that I had sold my first novel, and that I was also paying tribute to my grandmother's experiences. You know, even if I was fictionalizing members of her family and making them do things that my mom didn't quite agree with, she overall was so touched that this story she had retold me 100 times had made such an impact on me that I wanted to put it down on paper.
But let's, I mean, I guess I'm just wondering, since you did the research, do you think families should keep secrets?
Oh, for the, okay, too, I think they should have done that.
Yeah.
Well, you know, it's funny. I wrote Florence Adler, feeling strongly that I had it all figured out.
Right.
You know, that I knew what I was doing, and none of these ladies in my family did. And I thought, well, I'm really going to come down on the side of, you know, openness and transparency, and won't this be great? But I did write it in rotating points of view. So I wrote from the perspective of my great grandmother, who was keeping this secret from her daughter. And I have to say that after walking kind of a mile in her shoes, I was like more inclined to keep the secret than I would have been, you know. I mean, so I kind of, at the end of the day, by the time I got to the end of the novel, I didn't know how I would have reacted. Because I mean, that's the reason we write novels and we read them, is like, we want to build empathy, right? And so I ended up with all this extra empathy for her that I hadn't had before. So yeah. Well, I'm happy to talk more upstairs. I know we're moving on to the next part of the program,
Yes,
right?
exactly. So I just wanted to wrap it up by saying thank you so much for this. Guys, all for joining us today. As she was just saying, we do have a little send off to Books by the Sea upstairs, where we will be having a little tea and cookies event. So if you are part of Books by the Sea and you wanted to head upstairs, we will begin. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.